The summer of 1739 had come to Bavaria with a golden glare that turned every stone of Munich's palaces into shining mirrors. Outside, the city hummed with life. Merchants shouted their wares, children ran through sunlit streets, and the rich scented air carried the laughter of noble families in their gardens. But within the walls of the royal palace, shadows gathered, dense and suffocating. No gold could shine there, no laughter could break the silence. Inside, Maria Josepha von moved quietly through the stone corridors, her steps measured and careful. She was a duchess, born into wealth and power, a woman whose life had been planned since her first breath. Yet today, all her privilege offered no protection against the storm gathering around her. Maria's life had been one of structure, expectation, and careful obedience to tradition. At 16, she had been married to Duke Ferdinand of Bavaria, a match that strengthened alliances between two powerful houses. She had become a dutiful wife, a loving mother, and a public figure of elegance. Her days were full of charity work, diplomatic meetings, and endless ceremonies in which she was expected to smile gracefully, speak politely, and never falter. To the world, she was perfection. To herself, she was constantly aware of the delicate balance her existence required. A single misstep could shatter not just her life, but the lives of her children, her husband, and the future of her family line. And now that balance was crumbling. It began with whispers, soft at first, barely noticeable over the clatter of palace life. A servant spoke too freely, a letter was misread, a glance misinterpreted. But whispers, like wildfire, grow quickly. By the time Maria became aware of the talk, it had evolved into a storm. Accusations of adultery, scandal, betrayal. In 1739 Bavaria, such an accusation against a noblewoman was far more than personal shame. It threatened the bloodline itself. If Maria were proven unfaithful, her children would be considered illegitimate. Every title, every inheritance, every future opportunity for her family would vanish in an instant. Maria tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her like a shadow. The letters in court had been damning, supposedly intimate correspondence between her and General Claus von Sternberg, her husband's most trusted military commander. Handwritten, sealed, addressed in her own style. They painted a picture of clandestine meetings, whispered confessions of passion, even schemes to poison her husband. Maria had written letters to von Sternberg, yes, but they were formal, appropriate, political. Reports on campaigns, updates on household matters, polite inquiries. Nothing in those letters could justify what the court now claimed. These letters were forgeries, perfectly executed, meticulously crafted to destroy her, and yet they had all the markings of authenticity. The true architect of this cruelty was Count Heinrich von Leeuwenstein, the Chancellor of Bavaria. A man whose ambition knew no bounds, von Leeuwenstein had discovered evidence of massive corruption in Bavaria's administration. Von Sternberg had stumbled upon it, and if the truth came out, von Leeuwenstein's fortune, power, and life would be destroyed. He needed someone to blame, someone whose fall would appear natural, someone whose downfall would distract the world from his crimes. Maria, innocent and unsuspecting, became his perfect scapegoat. Her honor, her reputation, and even her life would be sacrificed to protect one man's ambition. The tension in the palace was unbearable. Servants moved like shadows, glancing nervously at each other, murmuring prayers. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, their eyes darting toward Maria with curiosity, suspicion, and fear. She noticed the glances, felt the stares, but her expression remained calm. She could not afford to show panic. Fear could be used against her. Power was being stripped from her slowly, almost invisibly, like sand slipping through the fingers of a hand stretched out to hold it. Her children played in the garden that morning, unaware of the danger surrounding them. Their laughter floated through the air, a cruel reminder of the stakes. If she fell, their lives would be destroyed. Illegitimacy was a sentence worse than death in Bavarian society. Her confession would protect no one but the ambitions of a corrupt man. And yet, every instinct screamed that she had to find a way to survive, not for herself, but for them. Then the summons came, a note, brief and formal, ordering her to report immediately to the underground chamber of the palace. No explanations, no guards to speak to her, just the words that made her pulse quicken. Report to the chamber at once. Maria's mind raced as she walked through the corridors toward her fate. Every step echoed in the silent stone hallways. She thought of her children, of Duke Ferdinand, of the letters she had never written but were now used to condemn her. The palace, which had always been a place of grandeur and safety, now felt like a cage, each door and stone wall a trap closing in on her. When she reached the chamber, the air was thick and cold. The smell of damp stone and iron filled her nose. At the center of the room stood the Judas Cradle, a metal pyramid 2 feet high, sharp, unyielding, and deadly. The executioner prepared the ropes, pulleys, and devices designed to hold her above the point until she broke, until she confessed, or until she died. Every detail had been designed to inflict pain, every moment of the process calculated to force compliance. Yet Maria was not alone in her thoughts. She felt the weight of history pressing upon her, the expectation of her family, and the silent judgment of those who might follow her story. She understood the cruel paradox. The device could destroy her body, but only she could control what her spirit would endure. The executioner, a man bound by duty and dread, asked the inevitable question: "Do you confess to adultery with General Klaus von Sternberg?" Maria took a steady breath. Her voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the thick tension. No. It was a simple word, yet it carried the weight of her entire life. No hesitation, no trembling, just truth. And then the descent began. The ropes strained, the cold metal pressed upward, and the first piercing pain seared through her body. Maria's mind clung to one thought: survival, not for herself, but for the children whose future depended on her courage. The palace was silent, save for the sound of her own breathing and the distant echoes of footsteps above. In that moment, Maria Josepha von was more than a duchess. She was a symbol of defiance, of courage, and the strength it takes to stand against cruelty. The world outside may have been corrupt, the men in power ruthless, but she would not break easily. Not yet. Not while the lives of those she loved still hung in the balance. And so the first hour of her ordeal began, a test of flesh and spirit, of cunning and endurance. The palace may have sought to destroy her, but Maria was ready to face whatever horrors awaited, determined to protect the truth and the future she alone could safeguard. Her story was just beginning.
The Palace of Munich had never seemed darker than it did that morning. Sunlight streamed through the high windows of the courtroom, but the brightness only highlighted the tension thickening in the air. Courtiers, judges, and officials gathered in anxious clusters, whispers circulating like smoke. Every eye was on the figure entering the chamber, Maria Josepha von, the Duchess, whose life and honor were now at the mercy of men whose loyalty was as fragile as a candle flame. Maria walked with her head high, her expression calm, though her heart thundered in her chest. She had spent her life learning the art of diplomacy, the careful words and gestures that maintained peace in a household, a city, and a kingdom. Now, none of that mattered. The courtroom was no longer a place of fairness, but a stage for a cruel performance orchestrated by Count Henrik von Lauenstein, Chancellor of Bavaria, whose ambition and greed had long been whispered about in secret corners of the palace. The accusations were laid bare almost immediately. Handwritten letters, allegedly from Maria to General Klaus von Sternberg, had been presented as undeniable proof of her adultery. The letters described meetings she had never attended, words she had never spoken, and promises she had never made. Each document was sealed with her personal mark, painstakingly forged to mimic her signature perfectly. The courtroom gasped as the evidence was read aloud, and murmurs ran like currents through the crowd. Maria's lips pressed together. She had recognized the letters immediately, their style familiar yet subtly altered. She knew the ink had been stolen from official reserves, ink only accessible to someone with her letters and access to the chancery. And yet, the judges, all chosen or influenced by von Lauenstein, nodded solemnly, as if the letters could speak for themselves. There would be no investigation, no consideration of her side. Her innocence was invisible in that room. Von Lauenstein himself presided over the trial, sitting in the high seat of authority. His eyes were sharp, calculating, betraying nothing of the storm he had unleashed. Maria's protestations, her denials, her unwavering truth, they meant nothing. Every witness was carefully chosen to support the narrative he needed, that Maria had betrayed her husband, that her actions had been a threat to the legitimacy of her children, that her fall was inevitable. The first witness was a servant from the ducal household. She had been coached carefully in the weeks prior, learning exactly what to say. When questioned, she recounted details she had never actually witnessed, words she had never heard. She described secret meetings between Maria and von Sternberg, clandestine whispers in hallways, and glances that implied guilt. Maria kept her composure, but inside, a storm of anger and fear raged. Every lie uttered in that courtroom tightened the noose around her neck, making the very walls seem to close in. Next came the palace scribe, an official with access to correspondence and records. He spoke of intercepted letters, misfiled documents, and proof of Maria's betrayal. Maria listened carefully, searching for weaknesses in their claims, but every word seemed meticulously rehearsed. Von Lauenstein had prepared for every angle, and it became clear that the trial was not about truth. It was about appearances. It was about creating a story so convincing, so believable, that no one would question it. Maria felt the weight of history pressing down. She was not simply a woman accused. She was a symbol, a pawn in a game that reached far beyond her. The corruption von Lauenstein had uncovered could topple his career, destroy his wealth, and bring ruin to his family. He needed scapegoats, and Maria and von Sternberg were perfect. The letters, the witnesses, the entire courtroom, they were instruments of a single purpose: distraction. She tried to speak. She tried to explain that the letters were forgeries, that von Lauenstein had access to the rare ink, that every word was a carefully crafted lie. But every attempt was cut short. The judges claimed she was being evasive. The witnesses' testimonies were treated as facts, and von Lauenstein's cold gaze reminded her of her powerlessness. Even Duke Ferdinand, her husband, sat silent, caught between loyalty, political pressure, and fear of the consequences should he oppose the chancellor. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. Maria's children, though not present, were never far from her thoughts. Every accusation against her threatened not just her life, but theirs. If the court declared her guilty, her confession, or the absence of it, would determine their fates. They could lose their titles, their inheritance, even their place in society. The knowledge was like a heavy stone pressing on her chest, making every breath a struggle. By the afternoon, the trial had become a theater of cruelty. Von Lauenstein moved with precision, guiding the proceedings, controlling the witnesses, and shaping the narrative. Every detail was designed to wear her down, to make her seem guilty even to herself. He understood human psychology. A person subjected to relentless pressure, surrounded by authority figures who all reinforce the same story, will eventually break. Maria knew this. She had studied the human mind in her education, yet now she was living the cruel lesson firsthand. Despite the mounting pressure, Maria remained composed. She refused to concede guilt. Each denial was a defiance, a declaration that truth could not be silenced. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision, but the court treated her honesty as obstinacy. They whispered among themselves, doubted her, and sometimes sneered as though her courage was arrogance. Even as the day closed, Maria knew that the worst was yet to come. The trial had only been the beginning, a prelude to a much darker reality. The Judas Cradle awaited, a device designed to break the body and force the soul to yield. She could not yet see it, but she could feel its shadow in every corner of the palace, in every whispered remark, in the cold glances of those who would carry out the Chancellor's plan. As the final words of the day were spoken, Maria left the courtroom with her head held high. The murmurs followed her like ghosts. The judges, the witnesses, the courtiers, they all knew the story was false. Yet the wheels of power moved too fast and too blindly for truth to intervene. Von Lauenstein had won this round. In her private chamber that night, Maria could hear the wind mooning against the stone walls. She knelt beside her prayer beads, tears unfallen, mind racing. She thought of her children, of their future, of the life she had built, and the world she now faced. The letters, the lies, the court, all of it converged into a single point of horror, the knowledge that she would soon face the Judas Cradle. Yet even in fear, she held on to something stronger: resolve. She understood one vital truth: their cruelty could shape my body, but it cannot take the courage in my heart. I will face what is coming, not with surrender, but with the dignity and strength that had defined my entire life. If I fall, it will be with purpose, to protect my children, to resist falsehoods, and to endure beyond the limits anyone imagined. As night fell over the palace, the city below continued its oblivious life. Children laughed, merchants shouted, and noble families dined in safety. But below the glittering streets, in the cold stone of the palace, a woman prepared to face a darkness unlike any other. Maria Josepha von, Duchess, mother, and innocent victim, was about to enter a nightmare of steel, pain, and human ambition, a nightmare that would test the limits of courage, truth, and the power of one person against the machinery of corruption. The trial was over, but the war for her soul, her honor, and her children's future had only just begun. The underground chamber of the Bavarian palace was unlike anything Maria had ever seen. Cold stone walls closed in from all sides, their surfaces slick with moisture that smelled of centuries of forgotten secrets. The air was thick, heavy with a metallic tang that made her throat dry. Torches flickered along the walls, their flames casting long, quivering shadows. And at the center of the room, standing like a cruel sentinel, was the Judas Cradle, a metal pyramid, sharp, gleaming, and utterly merciless. Maria's heart pounded as she approached it, each step echoing against the cold stone.
She had been told of its purpose in whispered warnings from servants who spoke of horrors beyond imagining, but to see it in person was different. It was smaller than she had expected, yet every inch radiated threat. The point was honed to perfection, designed to pierce flesh with agonizing precision. Every rope, every pulley, every mechanism had been engineered to inflict pain in a slow, unrelenting manner. The executioner, a man named York Massacre, stood waiting. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and silent, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hood. He had performed such tasks before, yet the instructions he carried today were unusual in their cruelty. He did not hesitate, nor did he speak as he guided Maria to the device. "Step forward," he commanded quietly, though his voice echoed unnaturally in the chamber. Maria obeyed, her mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and determination. She thought of her children, of their future, of the life she had built, and the honor she would not surrender. She remembered the trial, the forged letters, the false witnesses, and von Lohenstein's cold smile as he orchestrated her fall. All of it led to this moment. Ropes were fastened to her wrists, her ankles, and her waist, securing her to the framework above the pyramid. Every knot was tight, deliberate, and precise. Maria felt her body pulled, suspended above the cold metal point. The sensation of helplessness surged through her, but she fought it, gripping the edges of her courage like a lifeline. "You may confess at any time," the executioner said, almost ritualistically. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight far greater than any chain. "Confess, and the agony can end." Maria shook her head. "I am innocent," she whispered, barely audible, but her voice was firm. "I will not confess to lies." The ropes began to lower her slowly. The tip of the Judas Cradle brushed against her first, a small teasing pressure that made her gasp. Then, gradually, it pressed deeper, sharper, more precise. Pain flared through her body in a way that was both immediate and endless. Each second stretched into an eternity. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, yet she refused to cry out. Tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. The first hour was the worst. The mind struggles to process pain when it is constant, precise, and unrelenting. Maria's vision blurred at the edges, and every movement caused the sharp metal to pierce deeper. Yet even as agony threatened to consume her, she clung to the thought of her children. She thought of their laughter in the gardens, their innocent faces, and the future she had promised to protect. She was not alone in her suffering. The executioner watched silently, bound by duty, yet sympathetic to her plight. He adjusted the ropes with careful precision, ensuring that she would not be fatally injured too quickly. This was not merely punishment, it was orchestrated torment, a deliberate test of endurance designed to break her will. Hours passed. Time became meaningless. Pain blurred into consciousness, and consciousness blurred into memory. Maria felt herself slipping into a strange rhythm, a constant battle between the body's instinct to scream and the mind's resolve to remain steadfast. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum of war, a reminder that she was alive, that she could endure, and that she must endure. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in further, the shadows lengthening and twisting into shapes of mockery. She imagined von Lohenstein standing above, pleased with her suffering, believing his plan flawless. She felt the weight of injustice, the bitter realization that her torment was not punishment for guilt, but for truth. And yet, despite the cruelty surrounding her, she refused to surrender. By the 6th hour, exhaustion began to take its toll. Her body trembled uncontrollably, muscles spasming under the strain. The cold metal burned against her skin, every nerve ending alight with pain. She felt faint, dizzy, and yet her resolve remained unbroken. Thoughts of confession came and went, fleeting and unwelcome. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would not allow lies to triumph over truth. But her mind remained sharp. She considered every detail of her situation, the forged letters, the corruption von Loyenstein had hidden, the witnesses who lied, and the judges who turned a blind eye. She understood the cruel calculus. Her death would be a cover for his crimes. She realized that the device could not break her spirit. Only fear for her children could bend her will. And so she held on to hope, even as the pain threatened to overwhelm her. The first night passed in a haze of agony. Maria's body was battered, her spirit tested to the extreme, yet she remained unbroken. She had faced the first wave of the Judas Cradle, and though it had left her trembling and exhausted, she had survived. The chamber fell silent, but the shadow of what was to come loomed larger than ever. The days ahead would be worse. The pain would intensify, and the choices she would have to make would test her in ways that no education or privilege could prepare her for. Yet Maria Josepha von Bayern remained steadfast. She was innocent, she was determined, and she was willing to endure all for the sake of her children. And so, as the torches flickered and the cold stones whispered, she prepared herself for the next day, knowing that every moment of suffering would be a battle for truth, justice, and life itself. The descent into agony had begun.
The second day of Maria Josepha von's torment began before dawn. Though the underground chamber had no windows, no distinction between night and day. Time had become a meaningless concept, measured only by the relentless pain coursing through her body, and the occasional movement of the ropes that suspended her over the Judas Cradle. Her muscles ached, joints screamed, and her entire being ached from the tension of being held aloft by cold, unfeeling mechanisms. Yet in her heart, a fierce flame still burned. Maria's mind clung desperately to memories of life before this nightmare. Her childhood in the warm halls of her family's estate, the gentle hands of her mother teaching her letters and manners, the thrill of walking in the palace gardens with her husband before the shadow of suspicion had ever touched them. Those memories were fragile, but they were armor against the overwhelming cruelty surrounding her. Each recollection reminded her that she was more than a body suspended in pain. She was a mother, a duchess, a person whose truth could not be stolen, no matter how meticulously fabricated the lies. By mid-morning, the chamber was alive with the quiet, methodical movements of the executioner. York Massacre approached her, checking the ropes and pulleys, making small adjustments that would prolong her suffering without bringing fatal damage. Maria could feel every touch, every shift of her weight, and the anticipation of deeper pain was almost as unbearable as the agony itself. The first wave of questioning arrived with the day. Von Lohenstein's voice echoed in the chamber, cold and precise, addressing her as though she were an object rather than a human being. "Do you confess, Duchess? Confess to the indiscretions with General von Sternberg and end your suffering. A simple word can save hours, even days of pain." Maria shook her head, her jaw tight, though tears threatened to escape. "I have done nothing wrong," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I confess no falsehoods." A murmur ran through the guards and minor officials who had been stationed in the chamber to observe, but no one dared speak out of turn. Von Lohenstein's plan depended on the illusion of authority, the silence of witnesses, and the systematic crushing of both body and spirit.
Every refusal to confess was a step deeper into torment, and yet Maria's resolve was unshakable. Hours turned into another long cycle of pain. The metal tip of the Judas Cradle shifted minutely. The ropes stretched, and every micro-movement sent sharp, deliberate agony through her lower body. Her muscles spasmed, her nerves ignited, yet she clung to consciousness as if her life depended on it, because it did. The body could endure remarkable punishment when the mind refused to surrender. At one point, her thoughts turned to von Sternberg. He too had been a victim, accused and condemned without trial, executed in secret before any chance of defense. Maria grieved for him briefly, recognizing the cruelty that extended beyond her alone. Von Lauenstein had orchestrated a web of lies and betrayals that ensnared anyone who threatened his power. The general had stumbled upon the truth of embezzlement and corruption, and for that he had been silenced. Maria realized the stakes of her own endurance were far higher than her personal survival. If she broke, the consequences would ripple outward, destroying the very future she fought to protect. By midday, exhaustion was beginning to weaken her. She could feel the edges of consciousness fraying, her vision narrowing, her body trembling with both pain and fatigue. The executioner, following orders, ensured she remained conscious, administering a stimulant to prevent sleep and keep her aware of every agonizing inch of the metal piercing her. It was a cruel, calculated effort to maximize suffering, to demonstrate absolute control. Yet Maria's mind began to sharpen in unexpected ways. When the body is pushed to its limits, the mind often seeks refuge in observation, in strategy, in a form of mental endurance separate from physical resilience. She studied the mechanisms of her torture, the way the ropes moved, the subtle adjustments that caused incremental shifts in pain. She considered each moment as a measure of time, a unit in which she could prepare herself for what would come next. Her thoughts also turned to her children. Elizabeth, only 12, was far too young to fully understand what had happened. But Maria knew that her decisions in the chamber would shape the girl's life forever. Every second she endured without yielding was a second bought for their protection. Her love for her children became a shield, a reason to survive, a force stronger than the metal that sought to pierce her. In the afternoon, von Lauenstein's presence loomed again. He moved closer, observing her with the detached scrutiny of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Duchess," he said quietly, almost conversationally, "you prolong your suffering for a purpose, but at what cost? Your children's future is fragile. One word could save them from ruin. One confession, and all could be well." Maria's head shook, but the words cut deep. She had anticipated this, feared this, yet the threat of harm to her children introduced a complexity that torture alone could not achieve. She realized that her endurance was not merely a test of body or mind. It was now a test of moral and maternal resolve. Could she protect them without sacrificing herself? Could she withstand this agony and still preserve their future? The chamber fell silent again, except for the creaking of ropes and the subtle hiss of metal adjusting under tension. Maria closed her eyes for a brief moment, focusing inward. Her thoughts became a mantra, a rhythm to endure the relentless pain. She imagined herself in the gardens, her children laughing, the sunlight on her hair, the warmth of home. Every mental image was a lifeline, a reminder that the world outside this dungeon still existed, that her life had purpose beyond the chamber, beyond von Lauenstein's cruelty. As night descended for the second time, her body was weakened beyond anything she had imagined possible. Her skin was raw, her limbs trembling uncontrollably, and her senses dulled with fatigue. Yet, even as she teetered on the brink of collapse, her resolve remained intact. She would not confess to lies. She would not yield to falsehood. She would endure, not for herself, but for her children and for the truth that would someday, somehow, emerge. The executioner paused briefly, glancing at her with a mix of pity and professional detachment. He understood the limits of the human body, yet he also knew that the orders he had received were absolute. His hands adjusted the ropes, his movements precise, and Maria felt the renewed pressure of the metal. Pain surged anew, sharp and unrelenting, yet she did not scream. She only breathed, measured her thoughts, and clung to the memory of what she was fighting for. By the end of the second day, Maria's endurance had become almost legendary among the few who observed in silence. They whispered that she was more than human, that the will to protect her children and maintain her honor had transformed her into something unbreakable. Von Lauenstein had underestimated one crucial factor: love. Human love, maternal and fierce, could outlast even the cruelest machinery of human design. And so, as the chamber fell silent for the night, Maria Josepha remained suspended above the Judas Cradle, a figure of both suffering and defiance. She had survived the first day, endured the second, and understood that the days to come would test her beyond imagination. Yet she remained unbowed, her spirit a silent flame in the darkness, a promise to herself and her children that she would endure no matter what the cost. The second night closed around her, and with it the knowledge that her ordeal was far from over. The third day awaited, longer, crueler, and more relentless than anything she had yet faced.
Maria's endurance was no longer simply physical, it was moral, mental, and emotional. She had become a living testament to courage under unimaginable circumstances. And in the shadows of the chamber, as the ropes held her fast and the cold metal awaited the next wave of agony, one truth remained clear: she would survive in spirit, no matter what happened to her body. The descent into true suffering had only begun. The third day dawned, or rather the third cycle of light and darkness, since in the underground chamber the sun never reached. Maria Josepha von Bayern hung suspended above the Judas Cradle, her body battered, every nerve screaming, every muscle trembling uncontrollably. Her skin had lost its warmth. It had become raw, sensitive, and unbearably tender. Pain had become her constant companion, a shadow she could not escape. Yet within her a spark remained, a defiance that would not be extinguished, no matter how meticulously von Lauenstein's plan sought to crush it. The chamber was quieter than before. Guards and minor officials had grown accustomed to the harrowing scene, watching in silent horror as the noble woman endured. Even the executioner, York Massacre, now moved with a solemn reverence. He had seen countless victims, but Maria was unlike any other. She bore her suffering with a dignity and mental strength that transcended the physical torment imposed upon her. Yet the intensity of the third day surpassed anything the human body should endure. The ropes that suspended her body strained against the weight of exhaustion, pulling at her joints and tearing at tender flesh. The Judas Cradle, once a distant threat that she could almost imagine as an object separate from her, had become a living instrument of pain, intimately connected to her every movement. Each inch it pressed into her was a statement of control, a declaration that her body was entirely at the mercy of others. Von Lauenstein appeared again, his presence like a shadow stretching across the room. He spoke with the calm precision of a man used to commanding obedience, yet there was an unmistakable hunger in his eyes, a desire to see the last remnants of Maria's resistance crumble. "Duchess," he said softly, almost conversationally, "do you not see? Every hour you resist, every second you endure, it only prolongs your agony. Confess to your indiscretions. Spare yourself. Spare your children. One word is all it takes." Maria shook her head, her hair plastered to her sweat-soaked face, her voice a faint whisper. "I will not confess to what is not true. I will not betray my own name." Her resolve, however, was being tested in ways beyond her body's capacity. Pain had become a constant, unrelenting tide, pulling her closer to the edge of consciousness with every passing minute. Her mind, once sharp with strategy and resolve, began to feel the creeping influence of fatigue and torment. Thoughts jumbled together, memories collided with sensations of agony. Sleep and wakefulness blurred into a single, terrifying experience. It was during this third day that von Lohenstein revealed the true depth of his cruelty. He leaned close, his breath called against her ear, and whispered words that cut deeper than any metal spike. "If you do not confess, Duchess, your children will be declared illegitimate, every title, every inheritance, every future denied to them. They will be cast out, dishonored, and forgotten." The words struck Maria harder than the Judas Cradle ever could. Her body was already a map of pain, but now her mind was assaulted by an agony of a different kind, one that reached into her heart and mind, threatening to unravel the very core of her being. The future of her children, her beloved Elizabeth and her siblings, now hung in the balance. Her suffering was no longer merely personal. It was a shield for their lives, a desperate effort to protect them from a fate far worse than death. For hours, Maria wrestled with a moral and emotional tempest. Could she endure further, knowing that each moment of defiance endangered her children's future? Could she withstand the excruciating torment while bearing the knowledge that her silence might doom the one she loved most? The chamber, the ropes, the metal, the executioner all faded into the background as her mind focused entirely on this impossible choice. Her body trembled violently, muscles spasming in pain, yet her heart clung to hope. She remembered her mother's teachings, the lessons of courage and dignity passed down through generations. She remembered the promises she had made as a wife, a mother, a woman of honor. And she remembered the truth, that she was innocent and that her endurance had a purpose far beyond her own survival. Von Lohenstein, sensing the weight of the threat he had imposed, pressed further. "You see, Duchess," he said, voice low and chilling, "the choice is simple. Confess, and the agony can end. Refuse, and not only will you suffer, but your children will bear the consequences of your obstinacy. One word can preserve them. One word can save their lives. Can you bear that? Can you live with their ruin?" Maria's mind screamed against the cruel logic. She thought of Elizabeth, of the bright, intelligent girl who deserved every opportunity, every chance for happiness, every inheritance her birthright promised. The thought of her children suffering, of them being stripped of titles and status because of lies crafted by von Lohenstein, was a pain that cut sharper than any physical torment. And then, in the quiet spaces between her screams, between the jolt of each movement of the Judas Cradle, Maria made a decision. She would speak the words, not because she had done wrong, but because she would endure any moral compromise to protect her children. Her body had failed to persuade von Lohenstein of her innocence. Her will alone could not overcome the machinery of corruption. But her love for her children could guide her in this moment, even if it meant sacrificing herself. With trembling lips and a voice that was almost swallowed by the chamber, Maria whispered the confession. I have committed the acts you accuse me of." A silence followed, a pause heavy with the weight of her sacrifice. Von Lohenstein's eyes gleamed with triumph, but he could not know the true truth of her act. Maria had not surrendered to guilt, she had surrendered to love. Every word she spoke was a lie for the sake of her children, a lie meant to preserve their future in a world ruled by cruelty and deceit. The executioner noted her words, his hand steady, his expression conflicted. He understood the moral complexity of what had just occurred. Maria had chosen to protect life, to preserve what was truly valuable, even as she faced the ultimate penalty for a crime she did not commit. Yet von Leeuwenstein was not finished. Her confession, though a moral victory, did not satisfy his ambition. He sought complete domination, complete erasure of any potential threat. The torture, meticulously orchestrated, was ordered to continue, not for confession, but to ensure that no trace of her resistance remained. Her body would endure 4 full days, each second a testament to her sacrifice, each movement a reminder of the cruelty that power could impose. Maria's mind, though battered, retained clarity in its understanding. She had made the choice that only a mother could make, that only a woman of courage could bear. Her confession was not an admission of guilt, but a shield, a weapon wielded in the face of impossible cruelty. It was the ultimate act of love, the purest form of defiance, and the most powerful statement that one could make when faced with forces determined to destroy the innocent. As the day wore on, the chamber seemed to close in further. The ropes, the pulleys, and the cold metal were relentless, yet Maria's spirit, though tested to its absolute limits, remained intact in its purpose. She had endured for her children. She had spoken the words that would preserve their future. And though her body was breaking, her mind was resolute in the knowledge that her sacrifice had meaning beyond the immediate torment. The 3rd day ended with Maria barely conscious, yet profoundly aware of the power of choice, love, and endurance. Her confession had shifted the dynamics of her torment, but it had not erased the cruelty, nor had it diminished the injustice. Von Leeuwenstein had won in appearance, yet in truth, Maria had claimed a victory invisible but to herself and the future she protected.
As the chamber settled into silence once more, and the faint glow of torches flickered along the walls, Maria Josepha hung suspended above the Judas Cradle, a figure of both unimaginable suffering and extraordinary courage. The breaking point had been reached, not by the metal, not by the ropes, not by the executioner's precision, but by the impossible burden of choice, a burden she bore for love, for honor, and for the life of her children. The final day loomed ahead, promising agony beyond imagination. Yet Maria had demonstrated that the human spirit, though battered, could endure in ways that no instrument of cruelty could completely destroy. The breaking point had come, but it was a breaking point not of spirit, but of circumstance. The body could be tormented, the mind could be threatened, but love, the fierce, unyielding force that guided her actions, could not be broken. And so, as the chamber fell into a tense, heavy silence, Maria prepared herself for the 4th day, the ultimate test of endurance, sacrifice, and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit.
The 4th day began with a darkness deeper than any night, for Maria Josepha von Bayern no longer recognized the difference between day and night. Her body hung from the ropes above the Judas Cradle, every nerve screaming, her skin raw and sensitive beyond human comprehension. The chamber had become her entire universe, a world of stone walls, flickering torchlight, and the merciless metal pyramid that had already claimed so much from her. By now, Maria's mind had begun to detach from her physical body. Pain had become an almost external force, something that existed around her rather than within her, though the reality of it was undeniable. She could feel every spike, every jolt of the contraption, yet she found ways to observe herself, to maintain a sense of self, even as her body rebelled against her will. Von Leeuwenstein entered the chamber once more, his face impassive, but his eyes betraying satisfaction. He knew that the confession she had whispered the day before had not been born of guilt, but of love, love for her children that no instrument of cruelty could touch. Yet he also knew that as long as Maria lived, she remained a potential threat. Her intellect, her influence, and her reputation could still inspire suspicion, challenge authority, and reveal truths that might undo all his carefully laid plans. "Duchess," he said softly, almost as if speaking to a child, "your confession is noted, and yet the truth of the law requires closure. Your body has endured much, but it is not enough. Only when you no longer draw breath will your obedience be complete." Maria's lips barely moved. Her body was a battlefield of torn muscles, bruised flesh, and broken bones. Her eyes, once vibrant and commanding, were now sunken and dim, but the fire in them had not fully extinguished. She understood that this day would bring the ultimate test. She understood that her sacrifice would not end with a word, it would end with her life. The executioner, York Massassar, approached with a mixture of dread and duty. His hands, steady from years of practice, now trembled ever so slightly. He had documented countless deaths, but Maria was different. She was not a criminal in the eyes of the law, not a murderer or traitor. She was a noblewoman, a mother, a wife, and yet she had been subjected to a punishment meant for the vilest of criminals. Every fiber of his being wished he could intervene, but he was bound by orders, sworn to execute a command given by the chancellor. The ropes tightened further, adjusting her position above the spiked pyramid. Every movement was calibrated, designed to prolong agony without causing immediate death. Pain was a constant companion, relentless and unforgiving. Her muscles screamed, joints twisted unnaturally, and her breathing became shallow and uneven. Yet Maria's mind, though battered, clung to a single thought: Elizabeth. Her daughter's life, her children's future depended on her endurance. Hours passed in a blur. Time had become meaningless. Pain was measured in breaths, in the twitch of a muscle, in the echo of every gasp. Maria's body shook violently with the cumulative torment of 4 unrelenting days, yet her spirit remained anchored by the knowledge that her suffering had purpose. She had confessed to protect her children. She had endured for love, not guilt. By mid-afternoon, the chamber was heavy with a silence only broken by her labored breaths and the occasional creak of the wooden frame. Von Loyenstein watched with satisfaction, convinced that the torture had finally broken her, that her life would be extinguished without revealing the truths she carried. Yet he could not know that Maria's mind, even in its agony, was sharper than ever. She had already seen the power of love and sacrifice, and she knew that her endurance, even in death, could not be erased. The executioner paused for a moment, observing Maria's face. Sweat mixed with blood, streaking down her cheeks. Her hair clung to her face, matted and soaked. Every inch of her body was a testament to suffering beyond measure. Yet in her eyes he saw a quiet resolve, a determination that transcended the physical world. She had not surrendered to guilt, had not yielded to shame. She had only surrendered to necessity, the protection of those she loved. Von Loyenstein, impatient and cruel, commanded the final adjustments. The ropes were pulled tighter, the frame shifted subtly, and the Judas Cradle's spike pressed deeper than it had ever gone before. Her body arched, muscles straining, bones aching. Her cries echoed through the chamber, a sound that would haunt those present for the rest of their lives. And then, at 3:47 p.m., after 4 full days, her body could endure no more. Life fled from her with a final shudder, a testament to both human resilience and fragility. Maria Josepha von Bayern had endured what no woman should ever face, what no human should ever endure. She had protected her children with the ultimate act of love, a final defiance against cruelty, corruption, and injustice. The chamber fell silent. The guards, officials, and executioner, all present, were stunned into a quiet horror. Everyone knew she was innocent, yet no one had been able to save her. Von Lohenstein, for all his power, had achieved his immediate goal, the destruction of a duchess who could have exposed him. But in doing so, he had unleashed a force he could not control: outrage, grief, and the seeds of reform that would grow far beyond Bavaria's stone walls. News of her death spread rapidly. The city of Munich erupted in outrage. How could a noblewoman, a mother, a duchess be subjected to such barbarity? How could justice fail so completely? And more importantly, what had been hidden behind the veil of accusation, torture, and lies? Citizens demanded answers, demanded accountability, demanded reform. Maria's suffering, though personal and immediate, became the spark for a movement that would shake the foundations of European law. Within the palace, von Lohenstein's triumph was temporary. The carefully constructed facade of legality began to crumble as investigators, reformers, and ordinary citizens pieced together the true story. The forged letters, the hidden corruption, the threats against Maria's children, all were brought into light in a public that refused to accept the silence imposed by power. Elizabeth, only 12 at the time, would later learn the full truth. Her mother's final act, the lie, the confession, the ultimate sacrifice would shape her life, her mission, and her legacy. She would dedicate herself to ensuring that no other child, no other woman would ever face the horrors her mother endured. Maria's death, though tragic and incomprehensible in its cruelty, became the catalyst for change, igniting the movement to abolish judicial torture in Bavaria and beyond. As the day came to an end, the Judas Cradle remained, a silent witness to both human cruelty and extraordinary courage. Maria's body was gone, but her spirit, her sacrifice, and her legacy would endure forever. In her death, she had achieved something no amount of metal, rope, or malice could destroy: the preservation of truth, the protection of innocence, and the spark that would ignite reform across Europe. Maria Josepha von Bayern had faced 4 days of unimaginable agony, but in the end, her legacy was of courage, love, and justice. She had paid the ultimate price, but her sacrifice would never be forgotten. The final day of her life was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of a mother's love, a force stronger than any blade, any spike, or any tyranny.
The streets of Munich were alive with shock, grief, and outrage. Word of Maria Josephon's death spread faster than any messenger could carry it. Citizens, servants, nobles, and scholars alike whispered her name in disbelief. A duchess, innocent, tortured to death, her life ended on a device designed for criminals. People questioned the justice system, the morality of the ruling class, and the power wielded by men like Count Heinrich von Lohenstein. Within the palace, Duke Ferdinand struggled to contain his fury. He had loved Maria since he was a young man, admired her intellect, her grace, and her unwavering sense of duty. And yet, he had been powerless to stop her destruction. The revelation of von Lohenstein's schemes, the forged letters, the embezzlement, the manipulation of evidence, shocked him to the core. How had he allowed such a man to gain so much influence? How had he trusted the very person who orchestrated his wife's death? But Ferdinand's grief quickly transformed into action. Though Maria was gone, her story could not be buried. He summoned the remaining officials, demanded investigations, and ensured that witnesses were protected. Every detail that could expose von Lohenstein's corruption was pursued.
The forged letters were examined, the archives scrutinized, and survivors of the court questioned. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. Von Lohenstein's empire of deception began to crumble. Yet the true spark of change came from an unexpected source: Elizabeth, Maria's 12-year-old daughter. Though too young to participate directly in politics, she absorbed everything she could. The cruelty her mother endured was seared into her memory, and the courage Maria had shown under unimaginable agony became a guiding force in her life. Elizabeth asked questions, demanded answers, and refused to accept the half-truths offered by the court or the court's allies. Over the years, Elizabeth cultivated her knowledge and influence. She became an exceptional student of law, history, and diplomacy, determined to understand every mechanism that had allowed injustice to flourish in Bavaria. At 18, she received the secret letter her mother had written during the torture, the letter that documented von Lohenstein's crimes and Maria's forced confession. It was a revelation. Maria's sacrifice had not been in vain, and now Elizabeth held the tools to continue her mother's fight. Through careful planning, Elizabeth allied herself with scholars, reformers, and sympathetic nobles. She married into the House of Saxony, gaining political influence that allowed her to maneuver through a male-dominated landscape. She collected documents, interviewed witnesses, and preserved every fragment of evidence related to her mother's case. Her efforts were relentless, her purpose clear. No other person should endure what Maria had suffered. Meanwhile, von Lohenstein, though initially exiled and spared prosecution, could not entirely escape public scrutiny. While his wealth and family remained intact, his reputation was tarnished irreparably. Citizens of Munich, fueled by anger and mourning, protested the injustice, demanding reform. Maria's death became a symbol, a rallying point for those who opposed cruelty, corruption, and unchecked authority. The story of the Judas Cradle and its final victim reached philosophers, writers, and legal thinkers across Europe. Cesare Beccaria, Voltaire, and other proponents of justice cited Maria's case in their works, using it as a concrete example of the horrors of judicial torture. They argued, with evidence in hand, that no confession obtained through pain could ever be considered just. Maria's death became a cornerstone for the emerging Enlightenment principles of law, fairness, and human rights. Bavaria responded first. In March 1740, barely 9 months after Maria's execution, judicial torture was formally abolished. No longer would the state wield metal spikes and ropes as instruments of truth. Other European nations soon followed: Prussia in 1754, Austria in 1776, and France in 1788. Maria's death had ignited a chain reaction that transformed the legal landscape of the continent. Elizabeth, however, understood that the work was far from over. She used her influence to advocate for structural changes in judicial proceedings, ensuring that trials could not be manipulated by a single judge or official. She promoted the use of multiple judges, unanimous decisions for capital sentences, and strict oversight of evidence. Her reforms made it almost impossible for someone like von Lohenstein to control a trial from start to finish again. Through it all, Elizabeth carried the memory of her mother's courage. She often visited the museum where the Judas Cradle was preserved, standing before the cold metal spike and imagining her mother's strength. The initials MJB carved into its base became a silent testament to Maria's sacrifice, a defiance that transcended death. Some believed the executioner had etched the initials as a memorial. Others thought Maria herself might have left the mark in a moment of desperation. Whatever the truth, the initials remained, an enduring reminder of the cost of justice delayed and denied. Maria's legacy reached far beyond legal reform. Her story became a moral lesson for generations, a cautionary tale about the dangers of power, corruption, and cruelty. Human rights scholars cited her case as the moment Europe confronted the reality that torture destroys justice rather than reveals it. Legal ethics courses highlighted her ordeal as a prime example of coerced confessions and unchecked authority. Elizabeth lived a long life, devoted to education, reform, and diplomacy. She ensured that Maria's story was preserved, not just in archives or journals, but in the collective memory of a society moving toward fairness and accountability. Every law she influenced, every reform she championed, every principle of justice she strengthened, traced back to the sacrifice her mother had made on the Judas Cradle. Though Maria Josepha had died in agony, innocent and unheard, her life was not in vain. Her death catalyzed a transformation in Europe's legal systems, ending centuries of judicial torture and setting a precedent for fairness and human rights. Her daughter, Elizabeth, carried forward her vision, proving that love, courage, and integrity can outlast even the most brutal oppression. Today, when students study the history of law, human rights, or European reform, Maria's story is never absent. The metal pyramid in Munich's museum still stands, silent and sharp, yet it serves a dual purpose, a grim reminder of cruelty and a monument to the strength of a woman who endured the unendurable. Maria's legacy is etched into not only the museum, but into the very principles that govern justice in Europe today. Her story reminds us that progress is often written in pain, that courage can transcend death, and that the sacrifices of a single individual can reshape history.
Maria Josepha von Bayern was the last victim of the Judas Cradle, and through her suffering, she became a timeless symbol of justice, love, and enduring human dignity.